cemetery movement, a history of everything in 19th century America. That's a little ambitious, but I think I can back it up. So, if you lived in the colonial era, right up until the 1820s, and a member of your family died, they were probably buried in a churchyard or a small graveyard on the village green, something like that. And you might see a monument, something like this, with skeletons and skull and crossbones. And these are from burial grounds in Boston. And memento mori, you know, we all die.
You want a pen?
And there's that winged hourglass. So you know, cemeteries are cultural landscapes, and nothing that's at the cemetery or these graveyards happens in a vacuum. It's all based on the culture. There was an author in the mid-20th century, John Brinkerhoff Jackson, who wrote about the history of landscape and the cultural aspects of landscape. And he called these things cultural landscapes and sort of popularized that term. In other words, that the built environment, these landscapes, are totally dependent on the culture, and that's why they look the way they do. Coming up to the 1820s, we're starting to have a problem because cities are expanding, graveyard spaces at a premium, and people start to worry about some things. This is Trinity Church in Lower Manhattan, and that's the way it looked up until 1839. It looks more like that today. They had a 3.5 acre graveyard surrounding the church. And by 1826, they had buried over 100,000 people in that 3.5 acres.
Wow.
And the level of the graveyard was several feet above the level of the surrounding streets. And now they're starting to worry about, not only are they running out of space, and they ran out of space a long time ago, but they just kept burying. But they're starting to worry about public health. And you're burying these people in the populated areas, and a lot of them have died from epidemic diseases and things like that. Nobody's real sure about the germ theory at that time. And they talked about miasma. You know, cities stunk. You know, cities didn't smell good. And there was this theory that you could catch diseases from the smell. So just walking across the cemetery or across the graveyard, you might pick up some epidemic disease just from the air that rose out of it. That's really not true, but they didn't know anything else about it. So they start to worry about that. And the first change was the Grove Street Burial Ground in New Haven, Connecticut. And well, to show you what comes afterwards, that's Mount Auburn in Cambridge, Mass. And there you go. There's the Grove Street Burial Ground. Once again, it comes out of the culture at the time. You know, this is 1796. And you know, we're still in that age of the Enlightenment where people think that science, reason, and logic determines everything, and that's the way to understand life. And so everything is very rational, including this graveyard. All the plots were the same size. All the monuments had to line up in rows, so you could stand at the top and look down the rows. The monuments would all line up. There were trees planted like soldiers around the outside, and very rational plan. And the big difference was, instead of being in the center of town, now it's out at the edge of the city of New Haven. And that's sort of rural cemetery-like, but that's not the rural cemetery. It just doesn't fit. The graveyard doesn't fit. And the other thing is, to be buried at Grove Street, nobody could tell you that you couldn't be buried there. You came in and bought a plot, you could bury your family there. Before that, The churchyards, you had to be, right with the church, and maybe if you were burying your relatives on the village green, you had to be current with your taxes, or right with the village sexton who could. There was always somebody who would say, no, you can't bury your relatives there. Grove Street was different in that respect, and anybody could be buried there. As long as you could come in and buy a plot, you were fine. But the big change is the rural cemetery movement. This is Mount Auburn in Cambridge, Mass, and this is the first of the rural cemeteries. First of all, Grove Street was 6.5 acres, which people at the time thought was absolutely enormous for a graveyard. Because most graveyards were an acre, maybe an acre and a half or 2 acres tops. And so 6.5 acres seemed like an enormous graveyard. But Mount Auburn, they start out with 78 acres, which people thought was just outlandish. It was enormous. It was started by the Massachusetts Horticultural Society, so you kind of see where they're going. And you can see they have all these serpentine roads, and it's a landscape with lots of hills and valleys and formations and things like that. Because what's happening now, we're moving out of the Enlightenment into the age of American Romanticism. And you may think you don't know what Romanticism is, and I'm going to tell you that you probably do. If you know what the Hudson River School of Painting is, you know what American Romanticism is. If you've read books like Little Women and Moby Dick, you know what American Romanticism is. It's this infusing emotion into the arts, into painting and literature and architecture and landscape architecture. So, and that's the gate to Mount Auburn. And what are the architectural styles? There are these Romantic era revival styles, and in this case, Egyptian revival at the gate. And our first gate at Mount Hope was an Egyptian style of Egyptian revival style architecture. So, and there's a painting of a section of Mount Auburn. And there it is. And if I showed that to any of my Mount Hope colleagues and didn't tell them where it was, they would be searching all over the cemetery to find that space, because it looks just like what we have at Mount Hope. Hudson River School of Painting. This is a good example of the design ethic and the design concepts they're using. This is a painting of Niagara Falls by Frederick Edwin Church, and he painted Niagara Falls several times, and it's supposed to evoke a certain emotion, and a historian would call this an example of the sublime, which was supposed to be very impressive and almost frightening. And this painting, and I've seen this painting, it covers a wall. It's probably about 13 feet tall and about 26 feet wide. And when you stand in front of it, you almost get the impression that there's movement. And that's this romantic idea of painting. And there's another one, Thomas Pohl, really the first person to paint in that style. And here he is. And there's a story being told here. Out to the right, it's light, and you might even be able to see some civilization there, maybe a village or something like that. Out to the west, it's a little more mysterious and dark and almost forbidding. And in a lot of these paintings, you might even see a Native American down in the corner or something like that. And it was supposed to not scare you, but impress you with the mystery and the newness of that new land, which was the western part of the United States. Andrew Jackson Downing was he called himself a landscape gardener. He's really the founder of the whole idea of landscape architecture. I mean, we think of Frederick Law Olmsted, and Frederick Law Olmsted really formed it into a discipline of its own. But Downing was the first, and Downing is designing subdivisions almost. You know, he designs the first suburbs outside of cities, and he puts in these little Gothic, he called them cottages. They're, you know, they'd probably be bigger than most of the houses we live in today. And the roads are all not in any kind of a grid. They're not very city-like, and they're heavily planted. So, and if Downing hadn't died in a steamship accident in 1852, he almost certainly would have been the designer of Central Park in New York. So the other thing that's happening is, you know, the transcendentalists in New England, Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, they're talking about the quality of nature, and both of them wrote essays entitled Nature, and they talk about the transcendent quality of nature. There's something healthful about being out in the natural world. I don't think that's anything new to us. I think we believe that now, but it's new to Americans in the pre-Civil War United States, and so the other thing that's happening is we're entering this period of Jacksonian democracy. Suddenly, more people can vote. You know, there's no property restrictions to voting and things like that. So there's an expansion of democracy. So what happens with the graveyard? There's a 1846 drawing of Mount Hope. So we get this more democratized graveyard. The rural cemetery movement is based on allowing anybody to be buried there. And we have everybody buried in Mount Hope, from the very richest down to the very poorest, and we have a bunch of criminals besides. Anybody can be buried in Mount Hope. I do a tour in the fall called Mischief, Murder, and Mayhem, and I talk about murderers and bad guys and the cops and judges that brought them to justice. So we have everybody. It was meant to be the community's graveyard, and that was the basis of the rural cemetery movement. There we are. What does this look like? I just talked about the Hudson River School of Painting. This is a print from a little bit later, like 1870. But it looks to me like that Hudson River School of Painting, you know, with the sun shining down on the city over there at the right, and over here it gets a little more heavily planted and a little bit more mysterious. That's the rural cemetery. You were meant to feel like the cemetery, like it all spontaneously arose from nature, and but make no mistake, every square foot of Mount Hope and all of these rural cemeteries is a design space. And Mount Hope was very heavily wooded. There was a woman buried along the Mount Hope fence. Her name was Nancy Quackenbush, and her family had a small farm on the flat area along Mount Hope Avenue in what's now the cemetery. And it says on her monument she was born on this site and she is buried on the site. But during the War of 1812, the militia came through and they were commandeering draft horses and teams of oxen. And her father didn't want the oxen to be taken, so he had Nancy's brother take the oxen way back into what is now the center of Mount Hope Cemetery. The militia couldn't find them. It's such a heavily wooded area. So so when you go in there today, I mean, it's heavily wooded at the north end, but it's not like that. It's not impenetrable. Still, they weeded out trees. They put in new trees. We have lots of species that don't grow naturally in Rochester. Mount Hope, we belong to a thing called PlantSoon, which is a national database of arboretums. And we, Christine will tell you, we rate pretty highly on this thing just based on the number of species at Mount Hope. And we're still adding to that. That's a Japanese maple, and it's probably the largest and oldest Japanese maple in the region. And it's a lot bigger than it looks in that photograph. And we're on what's called a glacial moraine, and it's basically a large gravel deposit that was left by the ice sheet that covered the whole top third of North America during the last ice age. This is not Mount Hope. This is Mount Albion out in Orleans County, and they're on the same glacial moraine that Mount Hope is. And if you looked at a topographical map, you would see that this geological feature travels all that way. And but they take very good care of that cemetery. They have these very nicely terraced areas. And we have terraces, but they've a lot of them are kind of broken down. They're not as sharp as they once were. In Albion, you know how they cut the grass? They have a lawnmower on a rope, and they let that lawnmower go down, and they pull it back, then go to the next row and pull it back. That's 100 acres, and with plenty of these things. And there's Mount Hope in the wintertime, and it gives you an idea of the natural quality of this place. Frederick Law Olmsted, you know, the parks movement comes directly out of the rural cemetery movement. And Frederick Law Olmsted said that. He said in the 1840s and 50s, he is a journalist. And he said, you know, the only place that all levels of the culture, all levels of society, everybody, the only place they can go and the only place they mix is the rural cemetery. It's open to all. And William Cullen Bryant was a 19th century poet, Romantic era poet, but he was also the editor of the New York Evening Post. And he wrote a series of editorials in the 1840s advocating for a park. Now, you know, we think of parks like Highland Park and that sort of thing all across the country. There were no large-scale parks in the United States until about 1860. They didn't. Central Park was the first one, and they didn't begin designing it until the late 1850s. William Cullen Bryant writes these editorials, and the last one, he says in so many words, wouldn't it be great to have an institution like the rural cemeteries, but without the graves and funerals? And think about this. I'll bet you most of you have been to Highland Park, and probably a lot of you have been to Mount Hope. Think about Mount Hope without the graves. What do you got? You got Highland Park. So the parks movement comes directly out of the rural cemetery movement. In Buffalo, they have Buffalo's entire park system was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. And where did he start? He started adjacent to Forest Lawn Cemetery there, which predates the park system. Forest Lawn opens in 1843. And he wrote about this, and he used the cemetery to sort of extend the park space that he had. And so they recognized that the rural cemetery was this cultural institution that really served as the only large-scale parks in America until the 1860s and beyond. In the case of Rochester, Mount Hope opens in 1838. Highland Park is the first large-scale park in the area. It didn't open until 1887. So until that time, people are using the cemetery and picnicking in the cemetery. And if you had relatives that came from out of town, you would take them to Mount Hope. Ellwanger and Berry, the big nursery company on Mount Hope Avenue, they opened in 1840. And one of they started with 12 acres. They ended up cultivating 650 acres, all of what is now Highland Park. And what did they do early on? They established a horse-drawn trolley from downtown to Mount Hope Cemetery. And of course, by the way, it came right past their gate. But people weren't necessarily drawn to the Ellwanger and Berry nursery, but they were drawn to Mount Hope Cemetery, and the nursery company used that as a successful marketing ploy. There's the chapel at Mount Hope, and once again, it's in this Gothic revival style, this Romantic era architectural style. And the part, this is designed by Henry Searle, who was an architect in town. And today it doesn't look like that. Today it looks like that. And it has this addition added in 1911 by J. Foster Warner. And that's the original crematorium at Mount Hope. But he kept it exactly in the style of the original building. And the fountain out here, it was installed in 1875. It still works, and it works because the Friends of Mount Hope have spent a god-awful amount of money keeping it working. And it's sort of like the Industrial Revolution hitting the arts. It's very sculptural, very artistic, but it was made in a factory in New York City, the J.L. Mott Foundry, and shipped up here in crates and assembled on site. And you could, I don't have to tell this crew, like back in the 60s and 70s, where you could kind of order your car with the exact features you wanted. Well, you could do the same thing with this. You could pick from a pattern book. You could pick the style of the bowl, and the style of the gargoyles, and the statue at the top, and things like that. And but when you get done, it's this very sculptural, artistic part of the cemetery. And it indicates that there's more going on here than a graveyard. We have a gazebo installed about the same time, the fountain, all the hills and things like that. When you walk in the place that this was intended as more than a graveyard. It was intended for this park-like purpose. There's the second gate at Mount Hope, built in 1859, and it's in that Gothic Revival style. It's limestone, and the offices were incorporated in the at either side of the arch. And the original was built in 1839 out of wood in an Egyptian style. That one didn't last very long, but this was what replaced it in 1859. And then in 1874, it's replaced by the current gatehouse. And once again, these things don't develop in a vacuum. The gatehouse was built in 1874. Anybody know what's going on in 1874? Something bad is going on in 1874. The economy has collapsed after the panic of 1873. A lot of banks failed, and that comes from European investors had been investing in railroads in the United States. They went broke in Europe for a lot of reasons. They stopped investing. All that money dried up. The banks fail. A lot of the railroads fail. Things like that. So we're building this building in 1874 during the worst depression the country had ever experienced. In fact, up until the 1930s, they referred to that depression as the Great Depression. But they built this building. Why? To put people to work. There's no such thing as unemployment insurance. All the New Deal innovations that we take for granted, none of that existed. So city governments would mount these municipal building booms. Shortly before that, they had built the city hall on Broad Street, the old city hall that sits on Broad Street. And this building was designed by Andrew Warner, the architect of the Powers Building downtown, and lots of other churches and public buildings throughout this region. And the monumentation is different. We looked at those grave markers from the colonial period. This is the sort of thing you see in the rural cemetery. This is the family marker of the Erickson family. And Aaron Erickson was a wool merchant. He became the largest wool merchant in the country, and he made a killing during the Civil War, selling wool for wool uniforms. And he hired Cantalamessa Popodi, who was a sculptor at the Vatican for a while. Popodi came to the United States in the 1890s to be the art judge at the Columbian Exposition, the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. And he designed this for the Erickson family. It's the Weary Pilgrim, and it depicts a pilgrim on his way to St. James of Compostela in Spain. And he's resting. And we know where he's headed because he has this symbol, has this scallop shell on his shoulder, and that would alert other Christians to help him on his journey. So very nuanced and lots of symbolism here. And the cemetery has all kinds of hills and hidden places, and this is one of them. You go up a large hill and down the stairs, and you can't see it from up above, but there are the row of mausoleums. There are monuments for some very prominent families, and just below the staircase is one of my favorites. It's Dr. John Orlando Rowe. And Dr. Rowe practiced medicine in Rochester in the 1870s, late 1870s through the 1890s. And in 1887, he came up with a procedure that he referred to as aesthetic rhinoplasty. Anybody know what that is?
Nose job?
Right. And he's the first to come up with a procedure that wasn't to mitigate trauma or it didn't disfigure the patient. And I didn't know about Dr. Rowe, which I'm sort of ashamed to say since I work in a medical library. And I did a PubMed search when I heard about him, and I immediately got like 300 hits in medical journals all over the world. And Dr. Rowe is the first doctor in the world to do this, and here in Rochester. And Louis Henry Morgan, and this is sort of the epitome of that romantic Gothic revival style. Louis Henry Morgan was an anthropologist. He was a railroad lawyer, essentially, but he spent his life studying culture, particularly the culture of the Native Americans in the Iroquois Confederacy. He actually wrote a book called The League of the Iroquois, which is still a major reference on the Iroquois. And in 1862, his two young daughters died. I think they were both under 10 years old. And he went into a deep depression, and for a year he did almost nothing except design this mausoleum for his daughters. And it's very moving to walk up that road, and you're in sort of an isolated area, and suddenly this mausoleum appears. And it does what it was meant to do, evoke that emotion of that romantic era. And this is a little later one. Edgar Curtis and his brother Simeon were wholesale grocers, and the successor company to them is Curtis Burns, still around. And Edgar Curtis had this mausoleum built by a company called Leland, Weston and Lowe, who were over on Mount Hope Avenue, and they did cemetery monuments and some mausoleums. And I always think of this. It's certainly stylistically, it's not my favorite mausoleum in the cemetery because it's a mess. It has this Roman arch over the door. It has Byzantine columns. It has Egyptian battered walls on the ends. I speculate that Leland, Weston and Lowe, and I think Weston was an architect, but he didn't probably design this. They probably hired architects in town to do this. Whoever designed this was probably a retired architect. He probably designed in those revival styles, and this was his last hurrah. And he got all these different styles in there. And I know what he's going at. I know what he is going for. He's going for that. This is the Ryerson Mausoleum in Graceland Cemetery in Chicago. And it was designed by Louis Sullivan, the architect, in 1889.
Oh, I don't like that one either.
That's 1906. If I didn't have the dates on there, I think you would say that one's older, but it isn't. And I think he got that design. The architect in town got it because in the 1890s there was an article with pictures in the architectural record showing the Ryerson Mausoleum. But that's his version, and I don't think he did very well. There's a picture of Mount Hope done by RIT. They come to various locations with I don't know how many photography students and photographers, and their flashes all go off at the same time, and that's what's going on here.
That's beautiful.
And there we are, getting towards the end of the summer. So Mount Hope develops over the years. And if you walk through the north section, it's heavily planted. It's this rural cemetery model, all made up of family plots. You get down to the, notice the difference here?
Wow, yeah.
There's not so many plantings. And what sticks out?
More straight line roads.
Everything's lined up in rows.
Yeah.
This is the part of the cemetery that starts to develop after the Civil War. And it's no longer that rural cemetery model. It's there was a landscape architect in Cincinnati. His name was Adolf Strauch, and he was hired by Spring Grove Cemetery in Cincinnati to mitigate a swamp. But he didn't go away, and they kept giving him more and more work. Eventually, they made him the superintendent of the cemetery, and he redesigned Spring Grove Cemetery, which began as a rural cemetery, into what he called a landscape lawn or lawn park planned cemetery. And in the lawn park, first of all, everything's lined up in rows. You can still have your family plot, but it has to conform to the rows. And why is that? He didn't just do that because he felt like it. What's happening after the Civil War? We're beginning to use mechanical equipment to mow the lawn. And it's a whole lot easier if everything's lined up in rows. And there you go. Again, these are Google Earth shots of the south end of the cemetery. These are cradle graves that are up in the old section of the cemetery. Is that, did you take care of that?
I sure do.
The Yaqui plot? Yeah.
The Yaqui plot,
They're beautiful. They're beautiful. Thank you. So the cemetery continues to evolve, and you may be aware of some of these places, and you may have relatives buried, and you may already have your plots picked out in some of these newer graveyards. David Charles Sloan is a professor of urban planning at UCLA, and back in the late '80s, he wrote a book called The Last Great Necessity, and quoting Elias Leavenworth in Syracuse when they were dedicating Oakwood Cemetery in Syracuse. And The Last Great Necessity is probably the best history of American cemeteries and graveyards that there is. But about 8 years ago, he wrote this new book called Is the Cemetery Dead? And he goes on to talk about all the innovations, the things that are going on. You know, cremation starts in the 1880s, and but ground burial was the primary method well into the 20th century. Today, between 65 and 70% of deaths result in cremation. And number one, to the benefit of Mount Hope, it makes the ground go a lot further. You know, the city, I think they allow 4 cremated remains in a single grave. There are other places, there are columbariums and things like that. It will make the land last a lot longer, because once Mount Hope is filled, it becomes a really, 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 really expensive park to maintain. And so they want to keep that. Income coming in. And I don't think anybody from the cemetery could, if you held a gun to their head, they couldn't tell you how many ground burial spots are left in the cemetery. I think there's easily 40 to 50,000.
Wow.
So it won't be going away anytime in our lifetime. There are about 376,000 people buried in the cemetery. Christine almost jumped out of her chair. So 376,000 people buried in Mount Hope. Anybody know what the population of the city is today?
No. 100%.
It's about 207,000.
Yeah.
376,000 people buried in Mount Hope. So what comes after that lawn park? 1918, there's more of a businessman in Los Angeles named Hubert Eaton. And he establishes the first memorial park, Forest Lawn in Los Angeles. And this is new. And all these things represent what's happening in the greater culture. That lawn park, not only are they mowing with mechanical equipment, but it's coming about at a time when during the rise of the corporation and the rise of now we're past that industrial revolution. Now we're into the new industrial economy, big plants and complexes of manufacturing. Things like Henry Ford's River Rouge plant, where just enormous. So now, instead of having a superintendent and having the lot holders make many of the common area decisions, now you have a professional superintendent in the lawn park and probably a board of directors rather than a board of trustees, and they're modeling off that corporation and off that new industrial economy. So the cemetery becomes a completely different thing. And now, in the rural cemetery, you could put almost anything in your family plot, or you could plant trees and all kinds of things. In the lawn park, now that's all regulated by the cemetery. So first of all, they restricted the number of plantings there. So the major plantings, the heavy planting, is around the outside of the cemetery to sort of screen off the outside world. The grounds, the monumentation, a lot of these lawn parks regulated the type of monument that you could put in. Of course, after 1876, which is what? Oh, you guys are all sleeping. 1876 is the centennial of the United States, and so so people go back to the beginning of the country, and what's the architectural style? It's Greek Revival, Classical Revival, Romanesque Revival, that sort of thing. So a lot of cemeteries restricted monumentation to those styles. You could no longer just put up anything you wanted. And I know there are cemeteries, there are lawn parks even today who have approved epitaphs. Holy Sepulchre has 50 approved epitaphs. You can't put anything else on your monument, but you have to, if it's not one of the 50 approved epitaphs. Well, and of course you don't want people just putting whatever they want on these things, because today more than ever, I wouldn't trust a lot of my friends to put their own epitaph on. So anyway, but the memorial park, back to that memorial park, what's going on in the early 20th century? We have that corporation. Corporations become vertically integrated. So if you remember Kodak, they made film and cameras, but they had their own security force, their own fire department, they had their own landscaping department. Everything they did was in-house, and that's vertical integration. So what happens with the memorial parks? They become vertically integrated. And so you could go to the memorial park, you could buy your plot, you could also buy the monument from them. They would conduct the funeral, everything that you needed, they would take care of. And by the early 20th century, we're so far removed from the process of death that made sense to a lot of people. And what else is going on in the early 20th century? We are in this era we're at the height of the Jim Crow laws and a lot of racism and things like that. And maybe in Gates, I don't know, but a lot of the inner ring suburbs, if you go back and look at the abstract for your house, early 20th century, there may have been racial and ethnic restrictions built into the abstract. So you couldn't sell the house to blacks, or maybe Jews, or maybe Italians, or whoever they had a problem with. And of course the laws in the 60s did away with all that, but people are still talking about it. So you could live in a restricted neighborhood. And when you died, you could be buried in a restricted cemetery. What do you think Whitehaven Memorial Park means? It was restricted. And the memorial parks, they weren't at the edge of the city. They were out beyond the first-ring suburbs. And they were making a statement. There were a lot of these memorial parks all across the north, in fact, that have the word white in the title for no other reason than to alert you to the fact that that graveyard is restricted. And of course, they're not now, and I wouldn't lay that on Whitehaven, but it was, and that's where that name comes from. What else could that mean?
Yeah.
You know, in Buffalo, there's one called Whitechapel, and they're all over the place. So today, you know, there's all kinds of variations on this. There are green burials. You know, people can be buried without a casket, without the balls, any of that stuff. There's no law that says you have to have any of that. Those are rules that are established by cemeteries, mostly because you don't want to walk across the cemetery and have the grave collapse, and that's why they started with the vaults and things like that. But there's human composting they're doing now. There are all kinds of things. Cremation is big, you know, and I would bet a week's pay that somebody in this room's got one of their loved ones home in the urn on the mantle or someplace, you know. And you know, we live in a much more transient society. And sometimes people don't want to bury, you know, mom in the cemetery because they don't expect to be there for very much longer. So lots of things like that. So here's the encore. We're in Gates. You're the Gates Historical Society. Who's the most famous person that ever lived in Gates? Hmm? Not even close.
Oh.
Anybody?
Oh, it was,
The Inches.
No,
it's
no.
not. Must be Gates.
Susan B. Anthony
Oh,
lived
yeah,
in
because
Gates.
Gates went over the river.
Susan B. Anthony, you know, she was a teacher. She grew up in a Quaker family. Her father's mill went bankrupt in the 1830s. After that panic of 1837, she had gone off to her first teaching job in New Rochelle. Her father moves the family to Gates. And he had a farm right along the Erie Canal, right near what is today the corner of Brooks Avenue and Genesee Park Boulevard. But that was part of the town of Gates then. Now, later it was annexed by the city, but back then it was part of the town.
Thanks to Bill.
And so after teaching for about 15 years, she wrote a letter back to her father, asked if she could come home. And her father enthusiastically invited her to come home and take over the operation of the farm, because by this time he's an agent for the New York Life Insurance Company. He recovered from his bankruptcy and he's prospering, but he doesn't have time to operate the farm. So she comes home to do that, not her first choice. She came home by this time she's the headmistress of the school in Canajoharie, comes home with an idea that she needs to have an important life's work, and that maybe she could make her living in reform. She got a taste of it in the temperance movement in Canajoharie. So crazy idea, because there probably were, you know, no more than a handful of people making their living in reform. People like William Lloyd Garrison, who ran the American Anti-Slavery Society, and all of them were men, of course. So, but she comes home with this idea. 1851, she and a family friend go to Seneca Falls to hear William Lloyd Garrison and a British abolitionist speak. And on the streets of Seneca Falls, she meets Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And they hit it off. And they spend the rest of their lives working on women's rights and getting the vote for women. They began thinking they just wanted to get better civil rights, better property rights for women. Almost immediately figured out that would never happen until women got the right to vote. So they start pushing for suffrage. And they try lots of things, and they made only incremental progress. There was a law passed in 1848 in New York that gave women enhanced property rights, because before that, if you were a young woman and maybe your family was prosperous, maybe you had inherited money, maybe you operated a small business, then you got married, now you don't own anything. You can't operate a business because married women cannot sign contracts, only their husbands could. And some of that got changed in 1848. But they're pushing for more. And 1872 comes along, and by this time, those three Reconstruction amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments have been passed. 13th Amendment does away with slavery. 14th Amendment spells out who's a citizen, due process, and equal protection. And the 15th Amendment gives African American males the right to vote, something that she wasn't wild about. She thought that women should be included. She had no problem with men getting the right to vote, but she wanted women included in that amendment too. Frederick Douglass said, if we include women, the amendment will not pass. I think he was right at that time. So they read the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment says at the very beginning, and I probably heard this a million times because our, well, they're talking about the 14th Amendment. I don't want to go into that, but.
Go into it.
Yeah, but anyway, the first line of the 14th Amendment says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States. It says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. They read this and said,
Hey,
I'm a citizen. I was born here. We already have the right to vote. It says right here. It's reiterated in the 15th Amendment. So they decide to test the Constitution in 1872. You know, voting is governed by the Constitution, but the way we vote is governed by the states. And in New York State, there was a law that said that you needed to be resident in the state for the 3 months coming up to the election. 1872 was the first year in several that Susan B. Anthony had been home during that 3 months. So this is the year. She and her sister Mary and her sister Guelma go to the registrar up on West Main Street in their neighborhood and walk in and tell the registrar they're there to register to vote. The registrar is a 24-year-old guy named Beverly Waugh Jones, also buried in the cemetery. And his assistants, one is Susan B. Anthony's mailman. They're all young guys. One assistant is Susan B. Anthony's mailman, and the other one lives not far away. They all know who she is, and I'm sure as soon as she walked in the door, they knew they were screwed. So the registrar, Beverly Waugh Jones, he tries to explain to her that he can't register them because women aren't allowed to vote. And she sort of quietly backed him up to the wall, and she said, if you choose not to register us, I will bring you up on criminal charges and I will sue you for exemplary damage. She said, my lawyer, Henry Selden, agrees with me, and I know I can win. So the registrar doesn't know what to do. When this is going on, the federal registrar comes in, they ask him, he doesn't know what to do. They send a runner to get their lawyer, John Van Voorhees, also buried in the cemetery. And John Van Voorhees shows up, he's the lawyer for the registrars and elections inspectors. And he advises them to register these women to vote. He said, in so many words, he said, you're in trouble either way. If you register them, you violated the Constitution. If you fail to register them, you violated the state law that says that any voter who attests to being a legal voter must be registered. Otherwise, there are penalties for that. They didn't have, so they registered these women. Susan B. Anthony is surprised because what she wanted was to be turned away, get this case into the federal courts, get it to the Supreme Court, get some adjudication on this. She didn't really think they would actually register her. So election day comes, she goes to the polls with her sisters. Guelma is on her deathbed. She has to drag herself out of bed. She has tuberculosis. They go and they vote. And the elections inspectors allow it. Once again, she's thinking they're going to stop her. She's going to get this case into the courts. They allow her to vote. And 50 women in Rochester registered to vote. Not all of them actually went to the polls, but many of them did. There was a Democratic poll watcher named Sylvester Lewis at the poll where Susan B. Anthony and her sisters voted. And he filed a complaint. He went to U.S. Commissioner William Storrs, who is a low-level federal court judge. Anybody know what they call those guys today? Call them federal magistrate judges. And anyway, they do arraignments and warrants and things like that. So Sylvester Lewis goes to Commissioner Storrs, insists that a warrant be issued for Susan B. Anthony and all the other women that voted in the election. Commissioner Storrs does not want to do this, but he didn't have a choice. He issues the warrant. It goes to the federal marshal. Who's the federal marshal? It's a guy named Isaac Quimby. Isaac Quimby is a math professor at the U of R, and he's also the federal marshal. Before he was a math professor at the U of R, he was a math professor at West Point. And before that, he was a brigadier general in the Civil War, reporting directly to Grant. Grant's elected president, he appoints Quimby the U.S. Marshal for this northern district of New York. Quimby gets the warrant, and I can only imagine, I'm sure he said, I'm not doing it. Nobody wants to do this. So he hands it off to his deputy, Deputy Marshal Elisha Keeney. Keeney looks at it and said, yeah, I'd rather not do it either. And he hands it off to a clerk from the federal court, a young little guy who goes out to Susan B. Anthony's house, knocks on the door, asks her if she wouldn't mind coming downtown to have a word with Commissioner Storrs. She's not stupid. She knew what was up. She said, you know, I don't really know Commissioner Storrs. I don't know of any business I had with him. She declines. So the clerk has to go back and hand the warrant back to Keeney, who now reluctantly has to go out to Madison Street and serve the warrant for Susan B. Anthony's arrest. He goes out there, knocks on the door. He's a much bigger guy. He was the police chief in Rochester in the 1850s. He's a big guy. Shouldn't be afraid of Susan B. Anthony, but he is. He knocks on the front door. Her sister Mary ushered him into their front parlor, and Susan B. Anthony comes down from upstairs. Keeney tries to explain to her what he's there for. He commented on the weather. He had sort of a nervous grin on his face. He said everything, but he never used the word warrant or arrest. She stopped him, and she said, is this the way you serve all of your warrants? Would you serve a warrant on a man like this? She said, I demand to be arrested properly. So he pulls himself up, read her the warrant, told her he was there to arrest her for violating the Enforcement Act of 1870, which governed those 3 Reconstruction amendments. You know, it was pretty much aimed at the old Confederacy, but it served in this case. So she had no interest in making this any easier for him than she had to. She said, well, I'm not really dressed for court. He let her go upstairs and change her dress, cooled his heels in their front parlor for almost an hour. You know, if you're the subject of a federal warrant today, they kick your door in at 6 o'clock and take you out in your pajamas.
Yeah. True.
He let her go upstairs, change her dress. She comes downstairs, puts her arms out. She demanded to be handcuffed like any other prisoner. And then Marshal Keeney says, no, madam, that won't be at all necessary. So now, you know, it's 1872. There's no police car waiting out on Madison Street to whisk them off to the court. They have to take the horse-drawn streetcar down Buffalo Street, West Main Street, to get downtown. And when they get on, the conductor comes around to pick up the fares. Susan B. Anthony, in the loudest voice she could muster, says, I'm riding at the expense of the United States government today. She wanted everybody on that car to know what was up. Marshal Keeney paid her fare, which he would have anyway, but she was trying to make a point. They get downtown, they go before Commissioner Storrs, who, remember, he does not want to do this. He has a hearing that lasts an hour. He takes witness testimony, and he continues it. He has another hearing a week later, and by this time he's figured out a way to have her arraigned before U.S. District Judge Nathan Hall, who is now sitting in Albany. So they have to go to Albany for her arraignment. And she and her lawyer, Henry Selden, go to Albany. U.S. Marshal Keeney goes there as well. And they're arraigned before Nathan Hall. Nathan Hall sets her bail at $1,000. That's not walking around money in 1872. That's the equivalent of about $30,000. And they come out of the courthouse and they meet John Van Voorhees, who's also there because the elections inspectors are being arraigned as well. And Van Voorhees says to Selden, he said, well, no, it's a shame she can't carry that case to the upper courts. And she turns to Selden and said, why is that? He said, I couldn't see a woman that I respected put in jail, so I paid your bail. And that precludes you from getting that writ of habeas corpus and challenging your arrest. She was not happy. But she trusted Henry Sullivan, she went along. She told the marshal outside the courthouse, she said that she was getting ready to go to Washington for a women's rights convention. Keeney says, "Madam, you can't go anywhere. You are in the technical custody of the U.S. Marshal." She smiled and said, "Oh, I didn't remember that." She got on the train and went to Washington, and he didn't try to stop her. So she comes home, she mounts a speaking tour of Monroe County, went to every election district, every post office in Monroe County, and gave a speech entitled, "Is it illegal for a U.S. citizen to vote?" And she covered the whole county. The trial was supposed to be held in the Rochester courthouse. Finishes her speaking tour, and the U.S. attorney had yanked her in again, and he had told her, early on that if she didn't cut it out, he was going to ask for a change of venue because she would have polluted the jury pool, which is exactly what she's trying to do. So, first day of the trial, the U.S. attorney asked for a change of venue. The judge slams down the gavel and moves the trial to Ontario County, and that's why it takes place in the Canandaigua courthouse. So she does the same thing in Ontario County. They thought they were pretty foxy. They moved the trial closer, the trial date up, so that there's no way she would have time to cover all of Ontario County. They didn't count on her getting help. She called on her friend Matilda Jocelyn Gage from Fayetteville. Matilda Jocelyn Gage, if you think Susan B. Anthony was formidable, you would not want to mess with Matilda Jocelyn Gage. She came and they covered the county together and finished the day before the trial started. But the government wasn't fooling around. They had brought in, they had bumped this case from the district court where Nathan Hall would have heard it, and to the circuit court where they could basically assign their own judge. They assigned Judge Hunt, Judge Hunt, 2 months before the start of this trial, had been confirmed as the newest U.S. Supreme Court Justice. So they've got a U.S. Supreme Court Justice sitting on this trial in the Canandaigua courthouse to try her for voting in the election. And Judge Hunt was a Republican. He was sympathetic to the reformers of his day, including women, but he wasn't very sympathetic to the idea of women voting. So the U.S. Attorney Richard Crowley spent 2 hours detailing her crime, and her lawyer Henry Sullivan spent 3 hours in her defense. And one of the things Henry Sullivan did was call Susan B. Anthony as a witness. The U.S. Attorney objected. The judge slammed on the gavel and ruled that Susan B. Anthony was incompetent to testify in her own trial. First, women had never testified in the federal courts before, and defendants were generally not allowed to, in a criminal case, to testify in their own cases in the federal courts. So Henry Sullivan basically asked himself questions and answered them as if he were Susan B. Anthony, and accomplished exactly the same thing. When both sides rested, Judge Hunt pulled a piece of paper out of his coat pocket, smoothed it out on the bench in front of him. He ordered the bailiff to pick up a directed verdict of guilty from the jury foreman, and then had the jury escorted out of the courtroom. We got a problem here. What's the problem? The Sixth Amendment guarantees you, the criminal defendant, the right to a jury trial. The judge he's putting in a directed verdict. You can't do that. You can do it in a civil case, but you can't do it in a criminal case. And her lawyer is objecting to this. The judge goes on as if he hadn't heard it. He asked Susan B. Anthony if she had anything to say before he passed sentence. Dumb thing to say. She stands up and she launches into the argument all over again, and peppered with criticisms of the judge. And he tried to gavel her down, telling her she couldn't restate her case in her statement. And she just went on as if he wasn't there until she finished. And when she finished, she sat down. Now the judge is flummoxed. He has to tell her to stand up again. She stood up. He fined her $100, which she told him in court that she would never pay until women got the right to vote. And she never did pay it. So the judge sent Deputy Marshal Keeney out to her house to see if there's anything worth $100 that they could attach to pay the fine. Historians pretty pretty much think Keeney was, by this time, he's pretty sympathetic, and he's got to live in Rochester. So he comes back to her sentencing hearing, tells the judge that after diligent search, he found that Susan B. Anthony owned nothing worth $100. Her sister Mary owned the house, they couldn't touch that. She owned her papers, her clothing, her books, nothing worth $100. So Judge Hunt is a smart guy. He pretty much could have, he knew this was gonna happen. So he said the defendant shall not be committed until she pays the fine. People in the courtroom, there are lots of high-level legal minds. There's a former US president in the courtroom, Millard Fillmore, taking the train from Buffalo, watched the whole thing. They all look at each other as if to say, what the hell does that mean? And he said it again. He said, madam, you'll not stand committed until you pay the fine. What he's saying is, despite the fact that she's refusing to pay the fine, he's refusing to lock her up, which means she has no grounds for appeal. And that's how he thwarted her. So if you go out to the Canandaigua courthouse, they have a plaque on the wall outside the courtroom where that trial was held that said justice denied on that date in 1872. So she comes to us at the cemetery as a convicted federal felon. And on election day, this is 2024, people come and put their stickers on her grave marker. And in 2016, they did that. We expected 300-400 people. By the end of the day, we had 12,000. And we had to keep the cemetery open until midnight. They had to bring in lights and everything, so everybody got through the line. And they stood in line for like 2.5 hours to do this, and everybody was happy, and it was a fantastic thing to be a part of. And so after that, we had the monuments, they're white marble. We had them cleaned by a professional conservator, so they were beautiful. But we're looking at the 2024 elections, and we got to do something. So we had these plastic, covers made that slip over perfectly over the top of the monuments. Hers and her sister Mary's right next to it, and people put the stickers on that, and that's worked pretty well. We have some of those up in the gatehouse with the stickers all on there. So, I think the cemetery, Mount Hope, has gone back to what it was intended to be. This park-like space that is conducive to contemplation and meditation and just happy thoughts. I work in the medical school at the U of R, and let me tell you, medical students, a lot of them think they invented medicine, and they're going to tell you whatever. And so by the end of the day, some days, I've just had it. And so I go over to the cemetery, drive through the cemetery, maybe take a walk. It all goes away. So the cemetery is back to what it originally was. All right. Any questions?
Show pictures of the dead.
What were the cradle graves? Was that just the
Cradle graves. It was a Central European tradition. You find them in Germany and parts of France, and they would plant them. They were meant to be planters.
people were buried there?
People were buried there, and in front of the monument is this. We refer to them as cradle graves, but they're meant to be planting beds.
And they are not just for children, because a
Yeah.
lot of
Everybody
people
thinks,
think.
right?
Exactly. Exactly. Yes.
The cradle grave, is the body under the earth or
It-
is it on top?
It varies. With the monument, some of the monuments, the burial is in front, some it's in back, some the monument may be on the center. It depends on who was buried in the family plot first, and where there's space. So there isn't a consistent
How many ground
plan
plants
for
there
that.
are?
When did they stop doing funerals at home? Like I know in Spencer, there's a lot of houses with the big doors, that they were letting
Yep.
people out to parlors.
Well-
When did all that change?
I mean, I've never been to one at home, but I know of some that have taken place within the last 30 or 40 years. Yeah.
Jim's grandma, my husband, his grandma was in their
So
house.
it's still, my brother-in-law was a ranger in the National Park Service down in Northwest Georgia. And there was a lady that lived down there. When her husband died, she had him laid out in their bed.
Oh, God.
And people came to the wake.
It was
So,
more a norm long ago.
yeah, I think it was, because, you know, we were closer to that process of death. You know, early 19th century, you may have been family members that prepared the body, dressed the body. You know, by the end of the 20th century, you know, we're far removed from that. But there were still people that had the wake in their front parlor, right up until, I mean, probably still happens, just not very often. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you.